5, APUS lesson number 7, The Road to Revolution. In our last lesson, we had taken a look at the steps of colonial crisis and the beginning of a break, the widening of a distance on an angle between the British and their colonial subjects in terms of something that started small and began to grow wider and wider and wider, further apart over time as time went on. We're now going to see in this lesson how events take on a momentum of their own that nobody foresaw or anticipated, but led to places that largely were uncontrolled and unexpected by all parties, the imperial masters and the colonial subjects. And this deepening crisis begins in many ways with moving beyond the big question of what is going to be the big issue. And the big question, which we addressed in our previous lesson, was no one could really ascertain for sure, or in a definitive sense, who had authority over the colonial economy. The big issue, moving on into this unit, is that neither side never really understood the problems of each other. They sort of talked past each other versus talking to one another, and talked at each other without time for listening. And each side, the colonial subjects and the imperial masters, increasingly just saw the world through the tunnel vision of their own perspective, their own problems, their own dilemmas. And this lack of understanding was going to really fuel the fire and increase the tension that was going to be an unstoppable force in many ways for separation as people got beyond the point of reasoning and into the point of emotion. When we last left off, we had seen in our lessons that the British had attempted the Stamp Tax and the Stamp Act. It had failed. The colonials had protested. They had boycotted, stopped buying British goods. There was no revenue that was generated by this tax. As a result, England canceled the tax. Same day they canceled it, they also said, Parliament said, in passing the Declaratory Act, we're getting rid of this tax, but we're going to make the laws for you in any cases whatsoever. The colonials had a little bit of selective hearing on this. The colonial subjects were thrilled the stamp tax was gone, but they didn't really heed or didn't really take seriously the part about the Declaratory Act, didn't really believe that that was valid for them. They rejected that, but they were happy they were getting their way. England is left right where they were when they attempted to pass the stamp tax. There's still unemployment, there's still debt, they still have bills to pay from the 7 Years' War, and the government's trying to raise revenue. Seeing these colonial subjects as part of that empire, they want to raise some of the revenue off of them. And so they pass a new set of acts in 1767, the Townsend Acts. And with the Townsend Acts comes an added force in there. New taxes on many of the same goods that the previous Stamp Act, the Iron Act, and the Woolens Act and Hat Acts that put taxes on lead, paint, all sorts of materials. But they added something in. They added in the so-called writs of assistance, which was an empowering tool, a general search warrant for the Vice Admiralty courts to use to sort of go into people's homes and search in the most general sense, not have specific enumerated things they looked for, but search in the most general sense to make sure that all items in those homes were not contraband items, not smuggled items, not items that taxes had not been paid on. This only served to further inflame the colonials as they felt their personal property and privacy rights were now being violated, let alone the rights of taxation. So in response, you had the same sort of response. The Massachusetts Circular Letter goes to several of the other colonies from Massachusetts, and the same solution for the stamp tax is proposed again, a general non-importation or boycott on British goods. Well, the same result winds up being in there that there was from the previous tax. England's not getting revenue raised. There's a lot of frustration, and in March of 1770, as a failure, England cancels the Townsend duties or tax as well. A duty, by the way, good AP term, duty and an excise and a tax are all the same thing. Taxation, another term for that would be an excise or an excise tax or a duty. So the Townsend duties or Townsend taxes are canceled to this act. On the very same day they're canceled, the Boston Massacre takes place, which is a large mob of Bostonians gather around the customs house in central Boston, begin hurling snowballs, ice balls, rocks, etc. And the outnumbered half dozen soldiers or so that are outside the customs office are actually the ones who are in far more danger than the mob. From somewhere a shot is fired and several colonists fall dead. And the British are blamed for this as villains in many ways. It was largely an act of self-defense, but remember, one of our lessons of history is interpretive. The American patriots, those who are dissatisfied with the imperial rule, spin this event by labeling it as a massacre and are able to portray the event as ruthless British soldiers coming after defenseless colonists who essentially were minding their own business, and the British are being gleeful in the colonial characterization about doing this, and this inflames the colonies in many ways. England tries to calm things down. But as England tries to calm and back and step away a little bit, the colonials form committees of correspondence. This was in a pre-internet age, a pre-email age, and what you wind up having is the equivalent of networking. The same colonists who didn't trust each other enough to come together in the Albany Plan of Union to have an intermilitary defense force from all the colonies are now starting, their leaders at least, are starting to get to know one another. They have contacts and they discuss their problems. They write back and forth about their problems and issues, and they find increasingly they have one common set of problems, all coming from London. And so it starts to wear down and break down some of the barriers you see between these people in terms of the colonial leadership who did not trust one another. England says at this same point in time, moving on, that they're going to start to pay the salaries of the colonial governors and judges, which the colonies had always done. Historically, the colonies had used this so-called power of the purse to sort of influence judge decision, or not judges, but judges and governors' decisions in the colonies. And the colonials fear loss of influence. So they use these committees of correspondence to further network about their fears of what they're going to see as being portrayed as this sinister conspiratorial plot against liberty. That thing we called salutary neglect, they're gradually seeing it as less of a random fact that it's going away and more a part of some overall systematic plot that's making it go away. England decides that they want to try to solve a revenue problem still, because this revenue issue will not go away from them. Same problems. Remember how we began this unit? Neither side seems to appreciate or understand the problems of the other side. England is always talking revenue, 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 revenue. The colonials are always talking rights and liberties, rights and liberties, rights and liberties. They're talking different languages, and they're talking past each other versus at each other. And England decides to find a way to try to raise this revenue through the Tea Act. Okay, they put this Tea Act in place to kind of give the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales within the colonies. But they do it at a lower tax rate than the colonials had ever paid for tea before. They figure the colonials won't complain if they're actually going to pay less for their tea, even with the tax. They're misjudging the colonial argument. The colonial argument is not whether or not they can afford to pay the tax. The colonial argument is whether or not England is empowered to lay this tax on them at all. And in so doing, they inflame the colonials as seeing this as part of this big conspiracy against liberty, and there's a big standoff going on. The colonials say that they're not going to pay the tax. The British say they're going to make you pay the tax because that's the law. In Boston, the center of the radicalism for the revolution, the solution winds up being the Boston Tea Party, which you're quite familiar with from grade school and on. 346 chests of tea are dumped into Boston Harbor on one evening. And after that, the so-called Boston Tea Party, the rabble-rousers, if you will, the colonials behind it, they go home. They go home quietly. And nobody seems to know who did it, and no one's going to claim responsibility. The next morning, the British are livid. And as such, they say that it's time the colonials understand the nature of force. This is an empire. This does have a hierarchy. And this was an example of a blatant, open, public act of defiance and gesture of disrespect that the British could not allow to go unnoticed. And so these antagonisms become almost like a shoving match as each side shoves and counter-shoves and shoves, and they're shoving harder and harder and harder and harder. And reactions get more and more and more extreme. And each side gets from having that very narrow breach of separation between the two to a widening, yawning gap between their two sides in terms of the way they see the world. And so the British, in reply, or in response to this, passed the Coercive Acts. History is interpretive. Americans called the Coercive Acts the Intolerable Acts because they saw them as being an intolerable deprivation of their liberties. The British closed the port of Boston. They declare martial law in the city, increase the power of the royal governor, and say that any colonial administrators who commit crimes in the colonies will not be tried by a colonial jury of colonial peers, but will be sent back to England to be tried, away from the people who they might have wronged. And the colonials see this as having their rights now being stripped away in a formal, systematic way. And the other colonies, through the committees of correspondence and their workings together, the leadership of the other colonies, begin to have concerns that what could happen in Boston, if it succeeds in bringing Bostonians to heel, could happen anywhere, in any one of the colonies. And as such, a threat to one, increasingly from the Patriots' point of view, the colonial revolutionaries' point of view, becomes a threat to the rights of all colonial colonies. And it brings on for some considerable self-interest.